My name is István Kés. I'm the Executive Director of the Danube Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here for tonight's event. We have a rare privilege that we have two very distinguished, I dare say, scholars here with us, who are in the forefront of fighting the woke. I will introduce first Chris Rufo, who is the main star of the event, which doesn't mean that, of course, Rod is not a huge star, but Rod has been with us for, well, I would say basically years, off and on, but now as a permanent director at Danube, he's with us more permanently, thank God for that. So Chris has been in the front of fighting woke. I think first with, I think Chris was one of the persons who basically found critical race theory as a topic for conservatives. I think a lot of conservatives didn't know how harmful critical race theory could be in schools. And Chris was one of the first person who, with his documentaries and with his podcasts, really showed some of the more malicious part of the critical race theory in America. I think that wouldn't necessarily be the most important for average Hungarians, as luckily we haven't suffered that much from generally the woke, but I think especially from critical race theory in a sense, because of our own history. Luckily, Hungary cannot be blamed for the horrors of slavery because we've never had colonies.
Oh, yes, it can.
I know, I mean, I know that they can make up. I did talk with some Swedish Democrats who said that even Sweden is responsible for slavery because they produced the steel for the shackles, which I'm not sure how true it is, but of course, yes, you can always make up some fancy theory about these things. But I do believe that, I mean, we have our own horrible histories. Sadly, we did participate in the Holocaust, so we also have our troubled history, but luckily slavery and colonialism is not part of it. But another thing which I think Chris has been in the forefront is the so-called gender ideology in the classrooms and in the kindergartens. Which has also during COVID kind of surfaced as another threat to our families and children. We never thought before that we would have drag queens in kindergartens, or that we will have naked people shown in front of primary school kids. And I don't think that's actually okay, or we should have it, but sadly there are some progressive forces who think this is normal and it should happen. And I think a lot of people forget that when the Hungarian government, or let's say what Chris is trying to do now in Florida with Ron DeSantis, is we're not talking about homosexuals or transsexuals, we're talking about sexual propaganda. So we don't want heterosexual couples going into kindergartens and talking about how good is it to have sex. We want to protect kids from general sexual propaganda. I think that's an important point which you can talk a bit perhaps later. So just quickly introducing Chris. He's a visiting fellow now at Danube for a month, and his main job is being a senior fellow and the director of the Initiative on Critical Race Theory at the Manhattan Institute. He also is involved in Florida, helping in some form the work of Ron DeSantis. And now I will go on to introduce Rod, who is now director of our network project at the Danube Institute, and who has been very active in showing a kind of a Christian option how to fight the woke. And I'm just talking about this because I had actually a pretty interesting experience. I just came back from America from the Philadelphia Society event, where actually there was a real debate on what should we do as conservatives. And one option was actually Rod's Benedict option, which is kind of build up our own Christian communities and fight the woke with our own small communities, perhaps kind of getting out a bit of politics, which seemed to be one option, while they were saying that there's a second option, which they dubbed the new Constantine option after the emperor, where we kind of take over the state and use state institutions against the woke. And I think they didn't really know Rod's work that much, because I think Rod is actually supporting both, but he can speak a bit more about that later. So thank you for being here. You don't really want to listen to me. You're interested in the good speakers here. I will first give over the floor to Rod, who can start with his opening remarks, and then, of course, Chris can continue. So thank you for our speakers today, and thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you, István, and thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here with Chris. Chris has made himself into probably the most important conservative activists in the United States. And you weren't always an activist, and you weren't even always a conservative. So how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, that's right on both counts. And I started my own political development or political thinking on maybe even the far left. This was mostly because of being very young and being very excited and being very anti-authoritarian, but also in my own family history. My father's side of the family is from Italy. They're kind of long-standing you get left-wingers, communists, and so that was always something that was very attractive to me at an early age. And in the process of getting older, entering the work world, having had a chance to travel all over the world, producing documentaries in my 20s, and then starting my own family, my politics shifted very much to the right.
Funny how that happens.
It's very funny how that happens. It's a kind of inevitable move. But then also, the politics kind of impacted my own working life. I was a documentary filmmaker. I'd produced films for PBS. I sold a documentary to Netflix. And what's happening now with the woke ideology, the takeover happened 10 years ago in the documentary world. And so I had a real sense of where things were about to go. And as my own politics were shifting, my own career opportunities in the documentary world really vanished down to kind of zero. And so I ejected from that career and started doing some political work, some journalism, and then became an activist almost by accident. Was thrust into this with my reporting on critical race theory, became an activist in a sense by chance, and then found out that I enjoyed it. I had a talent for it, and then started figuring out how to connect my journalism, all the reporting on these topics, to actual policy outcomes. And that was really a satisfying thing because you see your gumshoe reporting, you see your writing and television work, then you see it turning into legislation or a presidential order or changing political life in the United States. And so, and for a lot of times, activist is kind of an epithet in some ways for conservatives. Oh, you're an activist instead of a objective journalist. But I enjoy it. I love it, and I wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the things that I think is very telling about our time and our country, the United States, is that none of this came from the Republican Party, and you didn't emerge out of the Republican Party, or out of movement conservatism, or out of the think tank world, though you are associated with some think tanks. But that wasn't your base. So what do you think it is about the media moment that we live in that you were able to do what you do, whereas conservative institutions were dead in the water?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that other people might have a different analysis, but from my own point of view, looking back, I think what I brought to the table was a very different perspective. So think tanks, kind of traditional think tank eggheads, look at it analytically, they look at it quantitatively, they write long policy papers. I've certainly done that. I'll probably continue to do that in a certain capacity. But they're documents that have very little purchase or very little travel outside of a very limited circle of people.
They're talking to themselves.
They're talking to themselves, but they're also talking in a language that doesn't activate any sense of emotion, any sense of forward action. And by contrast, what I learned as a filmmaker is that your footage that you're editing together, if it's not engaging people emotionally, if they're not outraged, if they're not crying, if they're not feeling a sense of doom, whatever emotion that you want to create through music, rhythm, image, light, character, conflict, all of those storytelling tools, that's when you hook your audience in. That's when you get your audience participating and following your line of action. And then you can then suggest to them what to maybe perhaps do about it in a documentary. And so that was my training, that was my background. And so when I'm going against something like critical race theory, I'm telling the story in a way that creates an immediate reaction. I'm framing the stories in a way, I'm using language, I'm making the argument, and at the very end of it, I'm saying, and this is what we should do about it. Actually suggesting a call to action or really a call to taking a policy step. And so those were unique in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, it's a journalism that is unapologetically out for chasing headlines, for moving people, for getting that perfect detail and shaping it in a way that engages people at an emotional level. And then, in contrast to some of our friends who think that journalism has to be, the AP newswire, kind of devoid of opinion, although that's changed even at the AP. I would go on Fox News, for example, Tucker Carlson, and say, this is the problem, here's the reporting, this is what you need to do right now. And so there was an activist component embedded into it. And I think that a lot of the narratives that I've been able to create in the last few years are designed increasingly in a conscious way to shape and to disrupt and then to overtake existing political discourse that's always intentionally oriented towards a political objective. And many people have said, you're not supposed to do that, you're not allowed to do that. I still haven't got the rule book. No one has provided that to me, saying why you can't do that. And I think that consequently, been able to create a new way of doing political journalism that, especially in the last few years, I've seen other people now start to emulate, and that's been something that's also been satisfying.
One of the things that I've seen, I've been a professional journalist for over 30 years, is that mainstream journalism, quote unquote respectable journalism, is operating by the same rules. They've been completely ideologically captured, but they wear the old-fashioned, we're just being objective standards like a skin suit. So we've seen this too in academia, which we can get to later, but this is one thing I think conservatives, at least in our country, really don't understand, is how following the rules are being used against us by the left, which has no respect for the rules except as a cover.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And I like to say, and I think I tell people very openly, I'm much more honest than my counterparts in the mainstream left-wing press, whether it's New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, a host of other outlets that pretend to be objective journalists that launder in their own political activism or political narratives. In distinction to this, I tell people very explicitly, I am an absolutely committed political journalist. I have political objectives. Here's what they are, A, B, and C. And I also even have developed this kind of habit or practice of actually telling people in real time, and this is how I'm going to then do this next campaign or reporting series. And so I'm trying to, through doing that, dispel this myth of neutral, objective journalism of the mainstream. But I'm also trying to demonstrate for people in our world, you can absolutely break that frame, and then you can attack this a very different way. And so I'm trying to teach people in our sphere, perhaps one way of achieving these political objectives that we have. Because, look, you don't become a political journalist if you don't have political beliefs. I mean, I find it just absolutely bizarre that people who spend their lives reporting about politics pretend to not care about political outcomes. I mean, it's just, it's absurd. It's like being a doctor, but not caring if your patients get sick or get healthy. I think it's baked into it, and I prefer to be honest about it, to be open about it, than to play some duplicitous game with it.
So you first made your name by attacking critical race theory, which you have called an existential threat to the United States. Can you first explain to our Hungarian friends what critical race theory is and talk about why you believe it is an existential threat to America?
Sure, yeah. So critical race theory, for those of you that are new to it or have maybe heard about it but not quite engaged with it deeply, which is understandable given that it's a uniquely American ideology. It's an academic discipline that started in the late 1980s and then gained steam over the course of the next 30 years. The basic tenets are pretty simple. Critical race theorists believe that the United States is a fundamentally racist country. They believe that the United States promotes the principles of liberty and equality, but those are actually a smokescreen or a distraction or mystification for what is, in truth, a system of repressive, capitalist, and racial domination. Critical race theorists then believe that in order to go beyond the system of domination, you have to dismantle all of the institutions in the country, including freedom of speech, including protections of private property, including equality under the law, and even including the existing kind of liberal civil rights apparatus, which they believe serves to actually deepen and entrench inequalities. They want to do away with all that. They want to redistribute property and wealth according to racial categories, and then create a system in which people are not judged as individuals, but are judged on the basis of group identity. And so the ultimate goal is to equalize group outcomes rather than what the Constitution promises and what the American promise had been traditionally, to recognize individual rights, and then, of course, to treat people equally as individuals under the law.
You know, in my book, Live Not by Lies, I talk about how immigrants to the United States from the communist world, from the Soviet Union and from Soviet-dominated Europe, were the first to see what was happening. They could see the fundamentally totalitarian nature of wokeness, of critical race theory, queer theory, and so forth. But Americans just didn't seem, people who were born in America didn't seem to think it could happen here in America. Similarly, I was raised with the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King, the colorblind vision. We were taught that is good and right and consonant with American constitutional principles, and now that's all gone away. Do you have a theory for why it fell apart so fast and why so many Americans are still so blind to it?
Yes, yeah, maybe take that in two parts in reverse order. So what you need to understand about critical race theory, and you need to understand about left-wing ideology more generally, I think the best way to interpret it is as a supreme disappointment with political equality. And so in the United States, we had in 1964 and 1965 civil rights legislation, federal civil rights legislation that finally guaranteed equal protection under the law. So with kind of some lagging, maybe enforcement, but in a sense you had political equality, which was always the goal. You'll be treated equally as an individual human being, regardless of race or sex, caste, color, national origin, etc. So you have this great and very hopeful moment in the mid-1960s where you say, hey, look, we finally have achieved equality as it was understood by the founders, which was always a political equality. But fast forward a half century, or now more than a half century into the future, political equality has not translated into material equality, social equality, and other more tangible and cultural manifestations of the promise of equality. And so the critical race theorists were trying to explain why that's the case. And their argument is that, well, all of those, we have essentially fake equality that creates a veneer of equal treatment under law, but actually perpetuates white supremacist governance. I don't think there's any real evidence that that's true. And in fact, actually, what I've learned as a filmmaker is that in some ways, unfortunately, if you look at aggregate as far on racial groups, in many ways we're more unequal than before. If you look at some of the leading indicators on social indicators, you have like household formation, family structure. African American communities are much worse off than they were in the 1960s and in the late 1960s. This is also now followed up with other communities, white communities, Latino communities, etc. But there is a sense, and a real sense, and I think it's something that is serious and has to be grappled with. The promise of equality has not materialized in the way that is satisfactory for many, many people. And so the critical race theorists, though, in my view, are kind of hijacking that sentiment to push kind of neo-Marxist, left-wing ideology that will certainly make it worse. But I think is predicated on this looming sense of disappointment that many people feel.
I think it would probably shock people in this part of the world to learn that communism is really not taught to American students, not at all, or barely touched on. I don't know if you ever had it growing up. Well, you had communists in your family back in Italy, but generally speaking, I grew up at the end of the Cold War, and we all talked about communism. Yeah. You didn't have to know Marxist theory, but you knew that communism was a thing, and many people had basic understanding of what it stood for and how it deformed societies and so forth. That seems to have gone away. You can't talk to young people today and find that they you can't have any expectation that they would know what happened. Do you think that lack of historical consciousness has something to do with the fact that wokeness has gone so far in our country?
Certainly, yeah. I think the second historical problem that is the context of this is that Americans, and especially conservatives, saw the collapse of communism as an absolute victory. And so American conservatives said, we fought the Cold War, we won, we've once and for all kind of relegated Marxist ideology to the dustbin of history. Never again will anyone try. They've seen the results, the catastrophe of the 20th century. And so they called it a day. They packed up and then forgot about it. And then, of course, someone who I grew up kind of in between. I was born in 1984, so kind of don't really remember the Cold War era, but kind of vaguely do. But certainly if you're born after 1990, you have no immediate experience of a world with communism. And you're not taught it in schools. What you're taught is racism, fascism, and Nazism, and sexism. So that's the only categorical framing in our public education system in most places. So those are, and a handful of others, they're kind of now becoming even more niche, ageism, or I read a piece of a K-12 school that was teaching that prioritizing adults above children is ageist discrimination. So they're getting even more specific, but the basic categories that they teach, and certainly racism is the first one. The only history is the history of the kind of World War II in Nazism and fascism, and then sexism, of course. So you're giving kids an incomplete historical education, but you're giving them also some very basic categories so that all the experience that they see around them can only be filtered or understood through those categories. And then, of course, this is then creating people that are very receptive to the ideas of critical race theory, systemic racism, racial oppression, patriarchy. And so they're primed then for, as they get older, to be introduced to gender ideology, left-wing racial ideology. And then the teaching corps in the United States and certainly in other countries then starts to bring those ideas from universities into the K-12 system. And so you have a generation of American kids that also doesn't have their parents. Like I imagine in Hungary, if you were born in 1990, the communist experience is historically very fresh for your parents. You're going to be hearing about it every day, But in the United States, we had almost an amnesia from the Cold War. It didn't affect us in a way as deeply as it did in Europe, and then was very quickly forgotten.
No, and that's how we are as a people. Generally, we don't like to look back at history. We always look forward. That is part of our national character. But I think in this case, it's leading us to disaster. You've also been active against queer theory in the institutions. Can you give us a sense of how what queer theory is and how it has affected the United States?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, queer theory is very different. I think there's some folks that like to think of queer theory as an analog of critical race theory. but intellectually it has very different origins. Critical race theory is kind of vaguely originates with critical theory or neo-Marxist theory, or what was once called Western Marxism. This is an ideology kind of post-World War II that picked up steam in the 1960s and 70s and then changed over time. Queer theory is very different, though. Queer theory, the genesis of queer theory is in postmodernism, of course, and gender theory more generally comes from a more postmodern tradition. Michel Foucault, you have a kind of left-wing Nietzscheanism that's then applied to the domain of human sexuality. And the basic idea behind queer theory is that that human societies have used rigid categories of gender and sexuality to enforce a heteronormative patriarchal system. So prioritizing heterosexuality, prioritizing a rigid male-female binary, and then maintaining kind of male supremacist power. And they want to disrupt that through different performances of gender. So you
performances of gender, what is that?
So the idea being that we aren't actually male and female. We are certain people that may have a biological category that is imposed on us, but really we are our performance. So if I choose to perform a different role, if I perform a female role, if I perform a non-heterosexual role, if I perform a kind of a role of my own invention, non-binary, whatever it may be, you can disrupt the hegemony of a heteropatriarchal system. You can undermine the heteropatriarchal power, expose it as an oppressive myth, and then have a society not beyond good and evil, but a society beyond male and female, a society beyond heterosexual reproduction. And so what they argue is that you can have a queer normative society that subverts heterosexuality, subverts the male-female binary, and then prioritizes a world that is liberated from all of those. So the idea is that once you get beyond all of the sexual repression and sexual categorization, you can have almost a sexually utopianist queer future. And so this is a postmodern idea that takes on steam in the 90s and in the future.
Okay, but this is clearly insane. And yet, it has conquered so many institutions in the United States, educational, media, the military, and especially big business. I mean, I think that when capitalism became woke, that was when the woke movement really, went into the stratosphere, when it had the power of big business behind it. What do you think about the role that big business plays in spreading this ideology? And I'll tell you where I'm coming from with this. Over here in Central Europe, I've talked to people in Poland and Hungary and other places who say that they are being compelled as employees of American companies or Western European companies to adopt this stuff, even though it's against their conscience. And I can see that the companies see themselves as the vanguard of the woke.
It's interesting, and it's a complex question. It's something that's new, but I did a series of reports mostly on critical race theory in Fortune 100 companies. And so I got documents leaked from all of these companies. I think I collected documents from 35 of the Fortune 100 companies. I did maybe a dozen stories, talked to a lot of people. And then I did a summary report that found that every Fortune 100 company, so these are the largest 100 companies in the United States, and in essence, the largest, plurality of companies, or probably absolute majority of companies in the world.
The super elites.
These are the super corporations, the kind of megacorps. All 100 had diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So this is the bureaucratic expression of critical race theory and queer theory. So on the racial side and on the sexual side. All of them, every single large American company has now put the official stamp of approval on these ideas. And so the question is, well, are the corporations the vanguard of this ideology? I don't think so, actually. I actually think most certainly they are not. but they're hostage to pressures, and they have internal employee activists that look at the institutional pressure points and try to push them as hard as they can. And then you have what I think is a broader collapse of any kind of moral hierarchy or sense of moral virtue or sense of kind of moral good. And so these woke ideologies have become, in a sense, a replacement system for the old moral systems of the past. So even companies 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, they would have corporate social responsibility initiatives. These were projects to educate kids in the inner city. They were projects to help families that were going through hard times. They were projects to have employees do neighborhood cleanups.
The United Way, the sort of
the United Way, yeah, which is good. The YMCA, the homeless shelters, more traditional American philanthropic initiatives that you can trace back to 150, 250 years. There's some great work from, I think, Howard Husock, where he talks about these philanthropic initiatives. And traditionally in the United States, we have the most vigorous civil sector, charitable, kind of non-governmental philanthropic sector, where typically the wives of successful American entrepreneurs would manage their social and philanthropic ventures. They would establish libraries and hospitals and schools and all of these good institutions.
Non-ideological.
I mean, non-ideological in the sense that they weren't overtly political. I mean, they're ideological in the sense that everything is. But they were oriented towards a kind of classical notion of Christian charity. That's really gone all out the window. Companies aren't interested in doing that. It's very hard to manage. It's very hard to show improvement. It's very hard to deliver results. It requires you to actually get out and say, for example, go to work with the homeless in the Skid Row part of downtown. It's much easier, and you get much greater rewards by just saying, we love, we're putting money behind a sexuality program in a school, or we're putting money behind transgender social media influencers. It requires small investment. You get a lot of media attention. You appease the activists within the corporation. And then you get to, in a sense, gain immunity from criticism from the professional activist left. Well, we put money into the, pro-trans movement or march or whatever it might be. That serves as a substitution for the much more difficult work of doing actual charity. And then you get, I think now, unfortunately, you actually get a much greater reward as far as public relations and other kind of measurements that companies care about.
But we saw just last week in the United States how this can blow up in a company's face. Bud Light is one of the best-selling beer brands in America. It's not very good. It just isn't, but it sells a lot, especially to blue-collar people. Well, the woman in charge of marketing Bud Light is a graduate of Harvard and Penn, Ivy League, and she decided that it was time to queer Bud Light. So they entered into an arrangement with this very annoying transgendered, male-to-female transgender to promote Bud Light, and it's blown up. Now, Kid Rock, blue-collar musician, put a video out of him blowing up some Bud Light with his AR-15 or something. I saw today that according to the beer industry, sales of Bud Light have collapsed. So you might ask yourself, how in the world does it occur to corporations to put a woman who is Ivy League educated in charge of selling a blue-collar beer? But this happens.
Well, I mean, so I guess those are separate questions. How does a woman with an Ivy League college degree end up as a corporate executive or kind of vice president of marketing? I mean, that's like the most stable pathway in order to get that kind of job. So that's the norm. That's not any kind of exception.
I guess my question is, why would businesses do this? A lot of people think that businesses want to make money. This is all about money, but they don't. They want virtue in their own communities, I think, or to gain honor among the people they respect.
That's probably, there's some truth to that. I mean, look, businesses want to make money. Businesses still want to make money. This could be a marketing mistake. It could have negative consequences, and the business will adjust. I'm not necessarily, though, convinced that it will have negative consequences. And the reality of it is, look, I mean, I have the kind of degrees that this woman has, and I know that kind of cohort of the population in American society. This is, I think like 50 or 60% of the students who graduate from a Georgetown or a Harvard or a Yale or Princeton go into finance, management consulting, a couple of other professions. And so this is the pathway to get there, climbing up the corporate ladder. And then you're given an ideology. This doesn't, the marketing lady at Bud Light is not an innovative thinker or a dedicated political ideologue. This is the received ideology of the institutions. She's not taking any personal risk. Yeah. And in fact, anyone who would oppose this decision would be taking immense personal risk.
Because I think this is about class conflict, but culture, not money, being the area of contention.
Most corporate jobs are fake. My wife worked in some large corporations like Microsoft and Amazon. I have friends that work at a high level in many of the biggest tech companies in the Seattle region. You get folks that are making big cash, $250,000 a year, $500,000 a year in American corporations. That they'll tell you, I work maybe 5 hours a week on actual hard work. This is a very common thing. You have a huge middle bureaucracy. And what really exposed this to me in a very interesting way, and I talked to some insiders that provided some additional insight, is Twitter. Elon Musk eliminated 80% of the employees at Twitter. 80%. So, the strong majority of employees at Twitter, and the product still runs the same, if not better, than it did prior to that mass layoff of all of these employees. And so what do you do when you're an employee in a soft discipline like marketing, where it's very hard to measure success or failure, especially in how these big companies run brands? Your edge is probably not going to be, being the most efficient, being the most profitable, being the most, the best with the best campaign. Your edge is going to be played on the playing field of culture. And so a lot of the times, and that said, the Dylan Mulvaney ad campaign.
Dylan Mulvaney is
this transgender kind of caricature performer. In a sense of driving public consciousness, is probably the best investment they've made all year. How much does a sponsorship cost for something like that? $50,000? I mean, these companies spend billions of dollars a year on advertising, and they're maybe a marginal investment, maybe 50, maybe 100. I don't know the rate sheet for Dylan Mulvaney, but it's not going to cost a lot of money to run a one-day social media sponsorship campaign. And they're generating more media conversation and media buzz than any other company in the United States. And conservatives are really guilty of this too. Conservatives are actually playing into this trap by focusing on this so much. You're actually you're giving free advertising to your enemies in a sense. And so, look, it could be the case that this was a mistake and it will hit profits. I'm not sure that it will, and I'm certainly not sure that it will in the medium term rather than just the short term. There might be a little dip, and I think things will probably revert to the mean.
That's depressing. Well, Chris, you moved into closer collaboration with Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Now, one of the reasons I'm excited about DeSantis is because he's not like your standard Republican politician who might give a good speech about wokeness but won't do anything about it. DeSantis is actually doing something. Could you talk a little bit about what DeSantis is doing and what makes him different on the American scene?
Yeah, it's been a great honor and a privilege to work with the governor. I've worked with the governor and his team on critical race theory, on gender, on the fight with Disney. And then earlier this year, he appointed me to be a trustee at one of Florida's public universities. So I'm helping reform one of these universities, taking it from what had been traditionally in the system the most left-wing university into a university of classical liberal education. So it's called New College of Florida in Sarasota on the beach. And so we're overhauling this university. But what I've observed with the governor and his team that he's assembled around him is that he knows how institutional power works. And he has the courage and the insight to put together policies and political strategies to actually shift institutional power, to shift law, to shift financing in a way that actually advances his political vision, or more broadly, a conservative political vision. And I think a number of unique traits. I think he sees the scenario better than anyone in the game. He has the patience and the follow through and the strategic wisdom to figure out actually how to appoint boards, how to move laws, how to get money from here to there, how to do all of the actual governance and institutional management.
Which
to make
Donald Trump does not have.
Does not have, yeah. I mean, you talk to Trump White House staff, and he was essentially running the government on Twitter, which is kind of amazing, and from my point of view, kind of a fascinating case study in a different leadership style. And not to say that every leadership style has to be the same, but when we're operating from a drastic institutional disadvantage as conservatives, it's essential to have someone that understands how to change institutions. And so the reality is that the institutions submerged Trump more than Trump reformed the institutions. I think that's an obvious truth. And I think with DeSantis, he's shown in Florida and could perhaps show nationally that he's actually capable of advancing against the institutions and then reorienting the institutions towards something better, towards something different. And I think the only other president in recent history, who had that kind of vision and unfortunately was unable to execute it was President Richard Nixon. Nixon understood the problem of bureaucracy better than any president, conservative president following him. But of course, Nixon was a kind of tragic figure and was ultimately kind of dethroned by the bureaucracy with the Watergate scandal and following that. So my own read on American politics is that we are stuck in a 1968 loop. We're constantly redoing 1968 over and over and over, both on the left and on the right. You have the Black Panther Party and you have Richard Nixon. That's the fundamental cultural dynamic that we're in, and we haven't figured out how to escape it. So even in Tennessee, I think Ishvan was just in Tennessee and saw some of this live, which is kind of interesting. You have these legislators in Tennessee that are that are doing what is in essence a Martin Luther King reenactment. They're dressing up in almost like old-timey outfits. They're speaking in a very affected black preacher voice cadence, that is totally inauthentic. You can listen to the same people who are doing the voice a year back, and they sound like Deloitte consultants. Yeah. It's kind of amazing. So they're reenacting, in a very vivid sense, reenacting 1968. And conservatives have never been able to move beyond 1968 or 1972, let's say, with Nixon. And so maybe not, but maybe, hopefully, someone like Ron DeSantis can actually break that dynamic and then transcend that dynamic, move beyond that dynamic. And if you look at it in a kind of basic Hegelian way, we're stuck in this dialectic, right? And we haven't been able to synthesize and surpass it. Yeah. And so I think that's the big question for us in the United States is how can we surpass this dynamic? And conservatives need to get smarter in thinking about it.
So let's shift then to talk about Hungary. You've been here 2 or 3 weeks now. What are the main things you've learned here in Hungary that you're going to take back to the U.S. and to affect your activism?
Well, I think a couple things. Certainly, more learning to be done. You can't learn everything in just a few weeks or a month, but I think there are some good lessons, and I think that from the conversations I've had with a wide variety of people, the Hungarians have understood the institutional problem in a very sophisticated way. And my reading on it is that when you have a state that controls all of the institutions as it was under communism, you get a very real sense of how institutions can kind of squash private life, can squash creativity, can squash faith, all of the various institutions that make life meaningful, through which people live their lives. And so a couple of specific initiatives that I found very interesting. One is revitalizing religious education. I was told, and I think it's probably accurate given the source, that Hungary has moved from a system in which approximately 5% of kids are educated in religious schools, predominantly Catholic schools, Calvinist schools, to something along the lines of 30%. And they're subsidized by the state to have kind of religious education, or the churches manage the K through 12 schooling. I think that's a really interesting way to do it. We're getting some of that now in the United States with universal school choice. Another I think important initiative is training elites. Look, countries are run by elites. Every country in the past and every country in the future will be run by an elite. This is inevitable. And so the question is, how do you cultivate this elite? How do you train this elite? And what principles and virtues should this elite be aiming toward? And the Hungarians, with some of these higher education initiatives and other initiatives, kind of civil society initiatives, are taking that question very seriously. And I think in the United States, we have just a few places where conservatives are attempting to do this, most notably Hillsdale College. But while I love Hillsdale, Hillsdale's
small conservative liberal arts college.
Small conservative liberal arts college. Well, I'm a great supporter. It's necessary but not sufficient. And so we need to do this at scale. And I think the question is, and the question that I've been grappling with and then thinking about as I've been here is, conservatives have been promising to reduce the size of the state for 100 years, for a century, more or less. Have never been able to do it. To the point where the United States public sector is larger on a percentage of GDP basis than the public sector in communist China. So
wow.
The American government, as a percentage of GDP, is larger and more expansive, although not more repressive, than the government of the sole remaining communist superpower. So conservatives have failed. I think that's safe to say, in kind of reducing the size of the state. So the question then becomes, well, if we're going to have a large state for the foreseeable future, and look, I support reducing the size of the state. Get rid of many, many things. But given that that's not going to happen in the near term, what should we do with it? And I think DeSantis understands this quite well, is if we're going to have a state, we have to make some kind of peace with this apparatus. And then when you win the legislature and you win the presidency or you win the governorship, you can't govern as a libertarian. That's a kind of it's not even oxymoron, it's an impossibility. You cannot be the governor of a state and govern as a libertarian. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you even run for office? What's the point? I'm going to win the governorship and then I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to let the free market decide. No, you have a duty to govern. You have a responsibility to manage the institutions. And you have a responsibility to use democratic power, not state power. You're elected through the democratic process. You have a responsibility to use democratic power to shape institutions in the best interest of your constituents. And that's what the big lesson that the Hungarians understand and Americans, I think, are still catching up.
Well, yeah, that's the big lesson that I learned from watching Viktor Orban when I first started coming here 2 years ago. It's that Orban seems to me to have an accurate read on how power is actually exercised, not simply through elected officials and the bureaucracy, but through NGOs and major corporations, universities, and so forth. And he seemed to realize, too, that the only thing that conservatives have is the power of the state through elections. So when I see some of the things Ron DeSantis is doing, I'm like, he's taking it from the Orban playbook, whether he's actually doing that literally or not. But that is, I think, going to be the only way that conservatives can compete with this overwhelming progressive hegemony within every other institution in the country.
I think that's true, and I think that conservatives are in a really interesting position where we have very little general institutional power. If you look at media, you look at NGOs, you look at kind of technology industry, if you look at arts and culture, if you look at other aspects of civil society, let's say, or private society. We also are operating at an extreme disadvantage in universities in the public sphere. Most federal bureaucrats, for example, lean very far to the left. In some of the departments, political giving is something like 90 to 10, 90-10 favoring Democrats. But conservatives still win elections. And in a sense, this is the key to everything. Because if you win elections, you get to make laws. And laws are the basis of everything else in a society, right? At the end of the day, the democratic power is the supreme power. That's how our Constitution is written. Of course, the government is supposed to secure the individual rights. The government it should be limited in a way that protects people's individual rights. But in a practical sense, the political power is the ultimate, this is the supreme power in the management of institutions. And so we have to get more sophisticated in how we manage it and how we run that. That's not to say that you should trample on people's individual rights. None of those, that's not to say that. What it is to say is that take setting the rules of the game seriously. If you have the not just the power, but actually the responsibility to craft laws and set the rules of the game of the society, and you're entrusted with that power by the public, you should do so. Because by abdicating and not taking those questions seriously and not taking action on them, you're delegating the basic rules of society to your opponents, to people who absolutely have no hesitation in trampling on individual rights, for example. And so we're going to have to wrestle with this. And one of the fears that I have and the questions that I'm trying to grapple with intellectually and then also journalistically is, are we already in a post-liberal society? I hope we aren't, frankly. I'm a kind of small L liberal at heart, of the kind of classical and constitutional sense. But I fear that we may have already crossed that into a new managerial kind of public-private kind of state and society are becoming one. And then are we in a bureaucratic society where those liberal norms and liberal principles no longer apply? I don't know. I don't answer. I hope not. But I fear that we are verging towards that in any case.
Yeah, I think that, I'm 56 years old, and I think that if you had gone back 20 years ago and told people where we would be today, not just in terms of wokeness, not just in terms of the sort of things that we show to little children in schools, drag queen story hour, things like that, but also just the way that so much of life is managed, people wouldn't have believed it. Yet here we are. And I think it's one of the things I like about living in Hungary is it feels kind of like America in 1995 when things were still normal, and stable. Maybe I'm getting an incorrect view there, but when I have friends who come over to visit from the United States, they're amazed by this place. First of all, because it's not what they were told by the media and the U.S. government that Hungary is, but also because if they're older, it reminds them of an America that has slipped away from us. Do you get any sense of that from being here?
A little bit, yeah. One thing, I was walking with my wife, and when we first, maybe a week or so after we arrived and kind of recovered from jet lag, and we're going out during normal times of the day here in Budapest, and we're going in kind of the hipster neighborhood and the Jewish quarter, and going to see some of the cafes and different places. Really nice, really fun. And my wife said, this reminds me of going down to Portland, Oregon, maybe 10, 15 years ago. Vibrant culture, creativity, arts, it may be a little rough around the edges, but there's a spirit of, of creativity. There's a spirit of there's like kind of culinary culture. There's a cafe culture. And I used to go down with my wife and my kids down to Portland all the time. Portland, Oregon, of course, is famous for the Antifa riots and homelessness. And
you wouldn't go there now.
Yeah. I go sometimes, but it's quite different now. It's a nightmare now, frankly. But 10 years ago, when we used to go down there as a family, or even 6, 7 years ago, before it started to really turn, And my wife said, "Oh, I wonder if, if this is like Portland 10 years ago, is it going to be like Portland now 10 years from now?" So I don't know. That question is really up to you, Hungarians, and how you manage your city.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of kind of going into the near past, not the far past, the near past.
The near past.
And look, I mean, the near past is a hospitable place to be because you know what the rules are. The near past was kind of nice. A lot of people like the near past, but the future, or the present in the context of Portland, is something you don't want. I mean, it really is a nightmare that even left liberals and progressives are starting to slowly accept after all the rationalizations, after all of the elaborate denial strategies. They're starting to see, wait a minute, it's actually not good to have, mentally ill, drug addicted kind of mobs of vagrants who set the street culture in your city. This is actually not good. People get hurt, people get killed, people overdose, businesses flee. You're ceding your city or your town to kind of to anti-civilizational elements. That's the only way to think about it if we're honest about it.
Okay, this will be the last question I'll have for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I was once asked I was speaking to a group of Hungarian graduate students. They asked me, where did things go wrong in America? And it was a difficult question, and I didn't give a very good answer because I had to stop and think about it. I don't know that we can point to one event that after that, wokeness was going to take us over. But let me ask you, what can Hungarians learn from our experience about what do they need to put a stop to right now or watch out for to avoid the trouble that we've had?
Well, I would say, there's this idea, I don't know if this translates in a Hungarian context, but there's this idea that there is a slippery slope fallacy. Are you familiar with that? Okay. I think as it turns out, the slippery slope principle is not a fallacy. It's more like a law. It's, the slippery slope is real. It's very slippery. It's very steep. And so I think that you have to set boundaries and set limits. And ultimately what these ideologies desire, whether it's critical race theory or whether it's gender ideology, is to transcend a world of limits, to transcend a world of nature, and even to transcend the impositions of human nature itself. Mm-hmm. So, they want to go to a world beyond scarcity, beyond necessity, beyond limitation, beyond restriction, beyond prohibitions, laws, etc. That sounds very nice in the abstract as you imagine it, or maybe you're, writing about it. Wouldn't it be nice to have a world beyond the limits of human nature? Yes, I don't want to get old. I don't want to, a whole host of things. It would be very nice to be able to transcend. But civilization requires limits, and you can't be shamed out of having a society that imposes limits, and people reject this. People don't like this. People kind of kick and scream about this. But what in the United States we have to do is reestablish limits, which is very hard. We're trying to do this, for example, at New College of Florida, where I'm a trustee. And we're trying to establish limits, order, excellence, all of these things. Merit, rigor, judgment on the basis of virtues or values or qualities. It's in a sense unpopular in the short term among a small but loud fraction of the people.
Including the professor who just said that if he were braver, he would burn the college down.
One of our professors recently sent in his resignation notice, and he says, if I were more patriotic, I would burn the college's buildings to the ground.
To stop fascism.
To stop fascism. Say, wait a minute, hold on here. You're saying if you were more patriotic, so you're admitting that you're not patriotic, first of all. Okay, fine, you don't have to be patriotic. But you think an act of patriotism would be to burn down an entire public university. He's only been teaching there since January of this year.
Oh.
3 months. He's become a hero. And what it was designed to do This guy's a tech guy, so not maybe socially very savvy. What he was trying to do is publicly say, I would burn the whole college down because Ron DeSantis and Chris Rufo are such terrible, bad people. And we know that the best way of fighting fascism is through mass arson attacks against public institutions. Also stupid. But then he tweeted it out. He published it publicly, saying that there's great virtue in burning down buildings. So I lit him up, other people lighting him up, the media is going to light him up. I think he's going to be gone hopefully sooner than his resignation date. But these are people who actually believe publicly glorifying and kind of implicitly threatening violence and arson makes them a moral hero. So he miscalculated, and he's going to pay the price for it publicly, which I find quite fun. And then the other thing is like, great, you're not on board with what we're doing, and you quit. Fantastic. This is great. You're self-selecting out. You're doing our job for us. So I told him, I said, thanks for your resignation. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I really mean it. It's like, and then students even came up to me and they said, I'm a far left-wing, gender activist student. You better do what I want. No, not going to do what you want. I'm sorry. We're going to do the right thing, that we're entrusted by the people of the state of Florida. We're appointed to this position. This is our vision for the college, a classical liberal arts education. And a lot of these students are so used to adults folding for them, bending over for them, doing whatever they can to accommodate them, scared of them. And I just said, we're not going to do that. And in fact, we're going to try to make this the best place, university. We're going to try, I hope that it's something that you can benefit from. But ultimately, if you don't like what we're doing, I'd be happy to find you a different university to attend. That's a mature, reasonable, adult thing to say. And the look of shock on the faces, it's like, oh, no one has ever told, I realized at that moment,
Yeah.
No adult in a position of authority has ever told these people no. And so I feel like, one of the great lessons conservatives can relearn is a basic lesson of parenting, it's a basic lesson of statecraft, it's a basic lesson of history. You have to learn how to say no. You actually have to learn how to say no straight to people's face, and you have to learn how to say no to people straight to their face that are yelling and screaming and threatening and throwing a fit. Like a child. You say no to your child who's throwing a temper tantrum. No. There's a lot of power in that. And I also tell people that, look, prohibitions are written into the fabric of human life. You look at the 10 Commandments. The first, you'd know better than I would. The first 5 are thou shalt not do this. Look, part of having a civilization means innovation within the context of limits. And so we want to have rapid innovation culturally, economically, socially, technologically, morally, beyond any kind of moral limit. And that's a disaster. And so one of the great, George Gilder, you probably like any George Gilder fans, mentor of mine, great American writer, he says you have to have high entropy and low entropy institutions that balance one another out. You don't want to have tremendous innovation in family structure, but you might want to have tremendous innovation in, let's say, digital technology. And those things don't always coexist nicely. They don't always, they always have, sometimes they're in conflict, but you can't have a society that innovates on every axis. You have to have a balance between slow and fast, between high innovation and high stability, between transcendence and prohibition.
Yeah, and on that point, I would say that the one thing I would encourage the Hungarians to learn is that it can happen here. In the United States, I saw so many people, conservatives, think, oh, this crazy wokeness, it's going to stay in academia or the media or maybe in New York, San Francisco. It's everywhere now, and it happens so quickly. And one of the main vectors through which it reached middle America and small town America was social media. So if you're going to make yourself resilient, you've got to be political in ways you've said, but the Constantine option, but you've also got to do the Benedict option in the sense that you have got to establish a routine of discipline and learning and spirituality and practicing religion in your families, in your communities, so you can hold on to what reality is. It's as fundamental as that. and the two can work together. Viktor Orban said once, I don't have the exact quote, but it made a big impression on me. He said that as a politician, he can give people things, but he can't give them meaning. In other words, as a politician, he can build the wall around meaning-giving institutions like churches, schools, things like that. But they have to step up, and families have to step up. And if you sit back, as so many American conservative parents do and did, and just let the pop culture raise your kids, if you're afraid to tell your kid no, and you think you're doing enough by going out and voting Republican, you're going to have a rude awakening one day.
Yeah, I mean, I see that. I'm a parent. I have 3 young kids at home, and I think I'm out there fighting every day, politically and public, traveling around the country, working on policy. But my ultimate and primary responsibility is to the people in my household, then into the people in my immediate community. And look, even on a personal note, the last few years, as these political winds have shifted so dramatically, we've taken action to do, in a sense, what you're talking about. As I'm more public, I'm also trying to re-engineer and restructure my private life. We moved out of the city of Seattle, which was just untenable, politically and socially, and for my own physical safety, unfortunately. So we moved to a small town, 10,000 people, different culture, different set of priorities, different structure of society, different political valence. We found a school that was classical, Christian, conservative in its culture and its curriculum and its school community. We found a great church, a Catholic church that, the priest is the kind of G.K. Chesterton Catholic, who he gets up there and says, we got to fight gender ideology in his homilies on Sunday. And then after Mass, the nuns that are attached to our church come and say, hey, Chris, keep up the great work, very, very supportive. And then even in the home, we have kind of a ban on technology. So no phones, no social media, no computer games for our kids. Try to get them, outside, talking to real people, which is actually a hard skill for kids these days. We had some kids come over one time, and they were having very difficult time. They were kind of freaking out, I said, hey, you need to eat? Do you have a blood sugar problem? Like, what's happening here, And then I realized, they're like, well, where's the Nintendo? Where's the phones? Where's the internet? And I say, very gently, well, we have a little bit different. We don't have that. We don't really do that. And I mean, the panic on the kids' faces was just unreal. And they're good kids, and hopefully they'll be fine. But those kind of actions require discipline. They require strength. They require going against the grain. They require sacrifice on your half, and really even for your kids. And I think it's really important to have all those local institutions and the people around you. The more that you can be aligned as far as your values, the better you're going to be, the better for your kids. And so, and it's a scary time for parents. And I was surprised to hear, even in Hungary, some dealing with some of these problems: anxiety, depression, suicide, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Kids are having a really hard time. And so, without trying to make your kids naive, I don't think I'm doing that with my kids. You do have to protect your kids, and then slowly let go, slowly open up over time. And and maybe this is just like every generation has this nostalgia, but I certainly think it's much harder for my kids than it was for me growing up. Almost everyone I know feels that way, and
absolutely.
You got to do it, whatever you can do.
So let's open up to questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. Ákos Bencegat from Danube Institute. I have a question. We spoke about the United States, and there is a recent news that tomorrow there will be a press conference by the US ambassador in Budapest, and they say that he may announce some kind of sanctions against Hungary. And I'm just questioning, I do not know whether it is true or not, but it's written everywhere in media. And if this happens, what do you think? Is it can it be influenced by these kind of ideological problems or differences between the two countries and the current ideologies dominating the United States institutions, or is it independent from this? What do you think about all these diplomatic questions? Would it be different if the Republicans were at power?
Oh, yeah, I mean, without a doubt, right? Yeah, I mean, I think I saw even Viktor Orban made a congratulatory tweet to Donald Trump recently. You know, he said, "Go get him, Mr." You know, Mr. So yeah, I mean, certainly a conservative government is going to have very different relations with Hungary than a left-wing or liberal government. I mean, it's unimaginable that a President Trump or a President DeSantis would be considering sanctions on Hungary. Quite the opposite. But you know, I would say, and I know, you know, the whole team here is very sophisticated. They don't need my advice, but my advice would be that you can't back down. I mean, you absolutely can't show any weakness. You can't show any hesitation, and sometimes you got to take the hit. And you know, whether there are real penalties, I don't know. It remains to be seen. But I would say that the American left oftentimes makes symbolic attacks, and if you push back against a symbolic attack, it may not have a material consequence. That's a different category, so I'm sure that we'll see. I'm curious to see now. I'm curious to find out what's really happening. But look, you can't back down, and the Biden administration has shown over and over that they view woke ideology as an imperial project. They want to impose this ideology everywhere. So to the point that even as Afghanistan was collapsing internally, the American embassy was hosting, you know, LGBTQ pride celebrations. They were pushing gender studies master's degrees at Kabul University. And I mean, just such a delusional idea that a country that has something like 70% illiteracy, it has, you know, kind of vulnerable to a military and economic collapse at any moment, that you're going to really be prioritizing to any extent, you know, gender studies master's degrees. It shows you how dedicated they are to the ideology. And for them, look, the United States doesn't need Hungary. It's not in our national interest. We don't import any critical materials from Hungary. The bilateral trade relationships are probably marginal, according to American GDP. And so the left is all in on cultural priorities. It's not a hard power question. The left, or the America and Russia, America and China, those are hard power considerations. With Hungary, it's pure soft power, pure cultural concerns. So approach it accordingly.
Yeah, and it has been really one of the most painful things for me as an American to live here and to see how my own country is behaving like an imperial power, like a revolutionary power, spreading this ideology, forcing it on people. Last month, I don't know if you know this, I think it was in February, Samantha Power, the head of USAID, came to Budapest to announce $20 million for transparency and democracy. This is color revolution stuff. The American people have no idea that our government is spending money on this sort of thing. I try to tell my fellow Americans, when they think about Hungary, imagine that Hungary as a nation is being treated the way conservatives are treated in America. Mm-hmm. They get it then. Somebody else, new question.
Oh, hi again. So you scared me a little bit with this notion that we are maybe in 1995 here. I don't want to be in 1995, seeing what comes after. But connecting to this, I have a notion that actually the US is in a kind of similar situation in which Hungary was in 2002. You might know that or learn that Orban already had a government from 1998 until 2002, and then came the next elections, and he lost it, and it was a huge shock for the right and for us, so to say, and it turned out that the reason, I guess, why we lost them was organizational incompetence from from Orban's party. They were just simply not present, their institutions were not there, and people in key positions were incompetent. They didn't have the competence for the elections to put the right people into places to collect the votes.
So what's your question?
The question is, I think that the Republican Party now is in a similar state in many states, disorganized, and they don't have competent people, and I don't see, for example, how Republicans can win key states next year in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in Wisconsin. We had just a huge loss in Wisconsin, losing the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So question is basically that. How do you fight this incompetence, and how do you put back competent people in place in these kind of... I know you managed a lot in Virginia with Youngkin.
Yeah, no, I mean, sure, yeah, I mean, Republican Party as a political party, I mean, is certainly incompetent in many ways. That I think that's absolutely true. Also similar to what you're talking about is conservatives are at an institutional disadvantage as far as their management of institutions. But at the same time, really good leadership can change that very quickly. And if you saw even the last midterm elections last year, the candidates who were running on a kind of the Dems stole the election, we're here for Trump message, like Carrie Lake or Herschel Walker or Dr. Oz to a lesser extent, lost. But the Republicans that went on, here's what I'm going to do for people, this is what I'm doing as far as good governance, I'm a solid, stable leader that can take my state forward in ways that matter to you, they won overwhelmingly. Mike DeWine in Ohio, the governor in Georgia, Governor DeSantis in Florida. And so I think people crave competence and they reward it, voters reward it. And so Republicans are going to face, I think, a difficult choice. But if they choose wisely, they get candidates that are competent, courageous, practical, service-minded, understand how institutions work. I think the political numbers can shift dramatically. I never, there's always some pundit or analyst or statistician that says, oh, this is the end of Democrats being in office, or this is the end of Republicans being in office. Oh, there's a permanent majority now. That stuff never pans out to be that way. It never works out that way. And so,
it's. I worry too about what's going to happen to the Republicans with Trump running. I mean, look, if he's a nominee in 2024, I'll vote for him because he's not as bad as the other guy. But I want to see things actually change. But I think so many American conservative primary voters are the mirror image of the left in that they value performance. They value the emotional gesture. And they're happy to own the libs and then go home while the libs manage the bureaucratic process to actually change things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that there's a tendency on the right, and you see this manifested in a couple ways. I think there's a sense of, I haven't fleshed this out completely, but we'll run with it. The left has done a really good job at mobilizing voters and activists on resentment narratives, envy narratives, personal identity narratives, grievance narratives. And I think there's a certain segment of American conservative voters that said, ooh, that seems really good. That seems emotionally satisfying. That seems actually quite easy to do. And then we're seeing the emergence of on the right of this similar kind of narrative, a grievance narrative, a victim narrative, they stole the election narrative. That is easy to do. It gives immediate emotional satisfaction, but ultimately goes nowhere. It doesn't build anything. It doesn't create anything. It doesn't offer anything substantive. And you're seeing it even on the basis of identity. There's almost a mirror image of left-wing identity politics, racial politics, critical race theory, let's say. There's a kind of ugly strain of right-wing and kind of white identitarian politics that you see at the margins that are trying to mimic the strategies of the left. And these are basically leftists who happen to be white, who then see a kind of pathway in the kind of fringe of the political right. And I think that, look, all of those developments should be rejected. They should be pointed out why they're wrong, and certainly should be demonstrated why they're ineffective. But there is a certain part of the conservative electorate that's seeking an emotional gratification through a kind of victim, and then failure actually validates those feelings. Let's say, let's imagine a scenario, or you don't even have to imagine it. 2020, they nominate Trump. Obviously, Trump's the nominee. They vote for Trump. Trump loses. He gets fewer votes than Joe Biden. That's called losing an election. That's just what it is. And of course, did they change some of the rules? Did they kind of manipulate the voting system? Did they have the Zuckerberg dollars? Yes. But look, you have to win the election before the election. You have to stop that stuff before it happens. But Trump's losing then served as a validation. That's very dangerous. You should be validated by winning. You should not be validated by losing. And I think that, look, I'll get beat up by this. People don't like it. That's fine. But ultimately, conservatives need to win. They need to govern. They need to deliver. A consolation prize, to me, is not good enough.
Yeah, Trump said at CPAC this year, "I am your retribution." It's like, no. I mean, I would like to see some retribution too, but you can't have a democratic politics that way. You need to have something positive to say.
Yeah.
And we have a good story to tell, but I wonder if many on our side don't believe it anymore. Anyway.
Yeah.
John.
We like to think that conservatives understand that human nature exists and is not totally unchanging, but fairly reliable. Let me just give you 3 things that have happened recently to raise the question of whether we're right about that, and if we're not, how worried should we be? First, a woman transitioning to a man goes into a Christian school which she attended as pupil and kills 6 people, 3 of them pupils. And the following day, the President of the United States issues a statement saying that transgender people are the better angels of America's nature, in effect. Secondly, in New Zealand, an English woman feminist who's about 5 feet tall is assaulted by a huge mob of almost entirely men, some of whom were transitioning to women, but most were not. But they were supporters of transgenderism, attempted to assault her, and the police said later that if she had actually stumbled and fallen, she was in the middle of a great mob, she might well have been trampled to death. And that happened. The third is that there are 14 states, members of the European Union, who have signed on to a court case against Hungary, which wants to condemn Hungary because it recently passed a law which said that children should not, or would not be allowed to attend gender and sex education lessons without their parents' consent. A decision which, by the way, puts the governments on the wrong side of a debate with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says very plainly, I think it's Article 12, that parents have a right to control their own children. I don't think any of these examples, with the possible exception of what happened in New Zealand to Kelly J. Keane, the English feminist activist, who is a kind of, well, she's herself a left-winger, but I would say a conservative feminist, so to speak. None of these events have occasioned anything like the upsurge of anger on the part of the population, or even much attention. A little, I think, in the case of Miss Keane, who excited a kind of chivalrous response from people who saw this. But none of these things have excited the kind of action, particularly in the case of the European court case, and the actions of governments, which include Ireland, in condemning the Hungarians and in taking, as friends of the court, positions against Hungary. None of these things have occasioned much public outrage. Can you comment on what that means for us?
I'll jump in first. The situation in Nashville was a real black pill moment for a lot of my American Christian friends, because we saw once and for all that You can even have a transgender person go in and murder Christians, including 3 9-year-old children, and the narrative that the elites prefer is going to prevail, even from the President of the United States and certainly in the media. And that's just where the country we live in now. The thing that I find most depressing about our situation in the United States, and it makes me despair of whether we can turn it around, is precisely the fact that we've had gender ideology marching through the schools. You have a number of states in the U.S., liberal states, where the government has the right to go in and seize minor children from their parents if the parents will not consent to giving them cross-sex hormones in their transition. This is the sort of thing that ought to have had every church leader in the streets bringing their congregations out, every family leader, and yet nothing has happened. Where are the churches? It seems that everyone is so demoralized that when they won't even protect their own children. Now that's starting to change at some state levels, but it just baffles me, Chris, that so many parents consent to this. And in Europe, certainly, I mean, Hungary is a pariah in the European Union because it actually cares about protecting its children from this malicious ideology.
Yeah, it's in a sense it is disappointing, but as a bright spot, what I was able to do with my reporting on critical race theory in the beginning of 2021 during the pandemic, I released a series of stories, I think 15 stories or something, documenting what was happening inside American classrooms all over the country. And, on social media, in print, on television, in other public debate fora, and something really incredible happened. I started to see these videos online of parents going to school board meetings and then just dressing down their school board officials. So in the United States, we have 14,000 independent school districts, public school districts that are governed by local people. And then I saw one or two. I said, oh, this is cool. They're reading my reporting on critical race theory. They're protesting. That's great. Then it was 20, then 50, then 100, then 1,000. Then more than 1,000 different parent groups all over the country started going to school boards, shouting down their school board officials saying, get this left-wing, racialist, and gender ideology out of the classroom. Back off from my kids. This is not what we want. And that was a big moment, to the point where even the Biden administration started threatening these parents, threatening me, saying that we're going to classify you as domestic terrorists, saying that we're going to classify you and investigate you. They actually had an FBI threat tag attached to any parents protesting, and certainly attached to me. I'm almost can guarantee you that.
What is a threat tag?
A threat tag is an FBI counterterrorism database tag, or like a label that they apply to parent protesters. And so we started getting that attention, and then we started overturning school boards. Hundreds of school boards started to change in election cycles. We started seeing parent groups all of a sudden go from just getting started to having 100,000 members. And then we started to see something even better happen. State legislators, which are kind of always looking to see what's hot, as they should, that's their job, started to say, well, now's the time for us to get school choice. Conservatives have been working on school choice for 60 years.
What is school choice?
School choice is this idea that that you can, as a parent, can opt out of the public school system, take, in our case, $7,000 or $8,000 per year per child, and apply it to any school of your choice, public school or private school, charter school, religious school, homeschool. You can take public dollars and then take them to private institutions or a home-based school institution. And this is like $7,000 or $8,000 a year per child. So if you're a family where you have 3 kids in school, in now 7 states, you can get then $21,000 approximately to spend on an education program of your choice. And the idea being that you can then take your money, your tax money, or your proportion of tax money, to a school that matches and reflects your values. Conservatives have been fighting for this for 60 years, had never once achieved it in any state as a universal option. And now all of a sudden we have, I think, 6 states with tens of millions of children now qualified for these programs. And so what you're going to see with this is that you're going to see a resurgence in private education, a resurgence in religious education, a continuing growth in homeschool education and classical education. And you're going to start to see options. So the idea of creating separate institutions. This got now a huge boost from public policy. And so I'm not in despair, actually. I think apathy is a huge problem. But just on the education side, with CRT, with gender, with school choice, we've seen that with sophisticated leadership, with good media narratives, with good activists, with good conservative institutional and political push, we can turn it around. And I feel optimistic about it.
Well, I see we're run out of time. I think we'll end on this note. I just want to say, Chris, that one of the lessons I learned in talking throughout the former communist world with dissidents who stayed behind, who didn't flee, but who stayed behind to resist communism, they said that the only way you're ever going to get anywhere is if you are willing to suffer, willing to risk public hatred, willing to risk prison, to stand up for what is true. Kamila Bendova, she and her late husband Václav Benda were the only Catholics in Václav Havel's circle in Czechoslovakia, but she told me, Rod, you mustn't think that all the Catholics were with us. They weren't. They kept their heads down too. She said the reason that we allied ourselves with these hippies, Havel and the others, was because they had courage. They were willing to stand up and go to jail for their principles. I think that the kind of courage that you show by putting yourself on the line, and other activists too, because no left-wing person has to travel in America with security, has to worry about their security. Right-wing people do, especially when they challenge the narrative. But it's that kind of courage that more people need to have, ordinary people, to stand up and risk being hated, being called a bigot, etc. If you're not willing to do that, nothing is going to change. That is the secret, being willing to suffer for the truth.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also getting through that fear. I certainly felt it when I started working in politics, doing political reporting. Even at a small scale, when I first started in the city of Seattle, which is very kind of notoriously left-wing city, the first time you go through that attack is terrifying. You get the attack from many angles. They're very good at this. This is how they police the discourse. This is how they squash dissent. It's not through, a police officer is not going to come and arrest you. Actually, the police are more amenable to our point of view. And they'll secretly say, these people are insane. They'll tell you that, behind the scenes when the cameras are off. But they do it through these activist networks, through media propaganda, through personal pressure, and then through street militants, in a sense. That's the final line where they start coming to your house, they start threatening your family, they start sending you, threats in the mail, whatever it might be. They start following you around the city. And then they start trying to damage your reputation. And the first time I went through it, I'll be honest, it worked. They won. I couldn't respond. I felt like I was being attacked from 1,000 angles. I was scared of my reputation being destroyed. I felt like the physical, kind of threats were a bit overwhelming psychologically. And I panicked. I admitted defeat at that time. Said, "Oof, I got to get out of here. This is not good. I'm getting my ass kicked. Essentially, that's what was happening." But that first experience, I learned everything you need to know about politics, and then I realized, oh wow, I'm still here. People still like me. I still have friends. I still, they called me nasty names. It's fine. And then once I got through that first big experience, that big challenge, that initial fear, you realize on the other side of that fear is freedom. You say, well, I've been through, they've called me all the nasty names. What are they going to do? Do it again? Who cares? Now I can actually say what I really want. Now I can say what I really believe. Now I know what's going to come at me. and I'm not scared of it anymore. And that's, to me, is true freedom, is when you let go of fear, let go of kind of overly concerned about your reputation, when you let go of what you think you should say to appease various people, when you let go of, of any kind of concern even for your own physical safety, when you're able to just come to peace with all that, that's where your freedom is, and that's where your power is. And so that's what I think is the place where everyone has to get to as soon as possible. And I imagine some of these dissidents felt the same way. Well, when you're an identified enemy, what do you have to lose? You might as well go at it as hard as you can.
Yeah. Well said, Chris. Chris Rufo, everybody.
Right,
Let's give him a hand.
Yeah, right.